Thanks very much for joining us for episode 26 of InTek Freight and Logistics, the podcast. I'm Kevin Baxter, and I'm joined by my co-hosts for this edition, InTek President Shelley Austin and InTek CEO Rick Lagour. On this episode, we pick the brain of a leading freight analyst with a focus on intermodal. Let's get started. Our guest today comes to us with a wealth of knowledge on freight transportation, particularly in the intermodal space, where we at InTek also spend a lot of time, in case you hadn't noticed from past episodes. He's consulted on transportation and financial issues in the U.S. and internationally, has worked on Wall Street, testified before Congress, is the co-founder of the RailTrends conference, a past president of the Motor Carrier Analysts Association, and been named Person of the Year by the North American Rail Shippers Association. We welcome Tony Hatch. Tony, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So I hit on a bunch of pretty impressive highlights there, but tell us a little more about your origin story in the freight industry, how you got into the field and what you're doing today.
Well, that was actually a pretty good introduction because it was nice and short and sharp. So I thought really you hit the high points. I was an analyst on Wall Street for many years, and I left the street to hang out my own shingle at the turn of the century. So I've had a lot of experience following the publicly traded companies in this space primarily. Since I've been an independent analyst, I have begun to cover as much of the private side of this business as I can. The key to my coverage are the Class 1 railroads. But I try to follow, if you view them as the sun, I try to follow all of the moons that impact them. And that could be IMCs, that could be car manufacturers like Greenbrier, that could be any of the companies that supply, add to, compete with the rail intermodal space. And I've been doing it on my own, as I said, since the turn of the century. That involves a lot of speaking. Maybe that's why at the end of the year, my voice sounds like this. But going to a lot of events, including NARS, as you mentioned, the North American Association of Railroad Shippers, who gave me their honor as Person of the Year in 2019. And as I like to say, there wasn't any ceremony in 2020, thanks to the pandemic. So I'm the only 2-year holder of the belt.
Nice job.
And I also hold RailTrends. Among the other big conferences, I go to all the major shipper conferences that I can. And of course, IANA is a big one every year for me. Coming up, we have the Midwest Association of Rail Shippers in January. That's a big one. It gets 900 people because it's located in the Chicago area, which is, remains the hub of North American freight transportation. So I guess that's a pretty decent summary of what I do. I speak a lot, I write a lot, and I try to learn everything I can about the rail intermodal space and then convey that to people who care, mostly financial institutions, professional investors, etc.
So what led you to get into that real area of focus with rail intermodal?
Blind luck. Good. I'll let you decide. I was in a training program at Salomon Brothers. Some of you out there may remember the book Liar's Poker. That was about the training program at Salomon Brothers. That was the first one. I was in the second one. I thought I was really cool. I was working at a famous Wall Street trading firm. I didn't realize that being an analyst was so uncool until I read the book. At that point, I'd already had a career started. I randomly was assigned basically to railroads. I had a brief choice. I could have been an analyst of something I didn't think was actually real, called wireless communications. That's gone on to do good things.
Yeah, turned out okay.
On an island somewhere, but instead I chose railroads. The idea behind freight transportation for me was you would never get bored because something is always going well. Or, if the auto cycle is down, the consumer cycle, i.e. intermodal, could be up, or grain could be doing well. It meant you had to know a little bit about just about everything that makes this continent go. And I thought that was interesting. And of course, going back to the railroad portion, the long history of this industry appealed to me. I was a history major in college.
Yeah, so there are a lot of good reasons there.
Yeah, I hope. Anyway,
so speaking of the cycle, then, talking about sometimes things are going well for one area, sometimes things are going not so well for another area.
Right.
What would you consider where we are in that realm right now?
Well, that's a very good question, probably the most important one, and so I probably can't answer it well. For our specific part of the space, the intermodal side, I think things are beginning to look up a bit. Obviously, comparisons are very easy. We've gone through a really unusual time from the railroad perspective over the last half decade, buffeted by events that they might have had something to do with. accidents in East Palestine, for example, things that are normal but were inflated and conflated as unusual bad events like the regularly scheduled labor negotiations, and then things that are highly abnormal that they really didn't have anything to do with causing, like the pandemic. Prior to that, perhaps we could even talk about the trade wars and tariffs and all that. So the last 5 years, I mean, real analysts always like to have a base year. This, year X is normal. So therefore, you're growing 4% above it or 2% below it. And here's what's what. And I would argue we really haven't had a normal year in the rail cycle, and certainly the rail intermodal cycle, since 2017. That's a long period of time to have, external events, shake you about like a toy boat in a bathtub with a little kid. That's sort of how I feel right now. I think things are getting to be a bit better because a lot of the things that the railroads, and I'm talking about it from a rail intermodal perspective, a lot of things that they can control, they finally are beginning to get some control of. First of all, it's employee, it's headcount, and it's, reducing attrition, getting more experienced crews in the field, improving their service, basically. So they are doing that. The service improvements did not come with the one-to-one level of volume recovery that we might have expected, because we're also in a very uncertain economic period. I would call it a slowdown, but not a recession, maybe a freight recession, and maybe we're just getting out of it. So it's really hard to say, but railroads that are doing better, whether that means, I used to use the line from Meatloaf, are they all revved up with no place to go? Are they finally getting enough crews in the field in time for inventory destocking, consumer retrenchment? That's possibly the story of the last couple of quarters. Hopefully not the next couple.
Certainly hope not, because we've really seen it, freight recessions, freight volumes down really about 18 months, which has been a typical cycle. This one looks like it's going to go more about 24 months, it would appear.
Yes.
And in terms of pricing, you referenced 2017. We've been watching, since we've been tracking intermodal spot rates, we've been watching 2019. And 2019 seems to be a real good parallel in terms of pricing against where we stand here in 2023. It's actually uncanny. We can almost pick the week and when it's going to go up or going to go down. And with you and your knowledge in the business, everybody's trying to pick a bottom. Everybody's trying to pick a top. The days continue to be pushed out. Well, it's going to be, we're going to see a recovery at the end of 2023. Well, that clearly didn't happen. Then people say, well, we're going to see a recovery first quarter. It just keeps on getting pushed out. And as we look at pricing on the spot market, that's a good indication of where volume is going, because this freight is definitely a supply and demand type industry, probably one of the best examples out there. And we're seeing that the pricing is following 2019. And if that's the case, then we would say that 2024 is going to, at least the first half, is going to be a challenge, because 2020 was a challenge if it were not for the government stepping in and starting to put a lot of stimulus money into the economy. What are your thoughts about 2024? And are we going to see a recovery in 2024? Or we're starting to see some people are saying 2025 even.
So that's a very good question. I mean, first of all, 2020 was a tough year.
Yeah, in the beginning for sure.
Well beyond intermodal pricing.
Yes, yes, for sure.
I would argue a couple of things about that. We may have broken or dented the, my belief here in railroad intermodal pricing being somewhat immune to the spot cycle, since so much of it's contractual.
Right.
The length of, as you pointed out there, the length of this down cycle has meant that even contractual rates, have a greater tie, I think we'll see when we look back to the spot market. In other words, the travails of the truckload market are going to impact intermodal pricing to a greater degree. I think the volume drop may have changed some belief in holding the line on pricing. So there may be more give from a rail intermodal perspective, an IMC perspective. So one of the things I would have said before is that the railroads, will wait for pricing to recover and retain that gap below the truck contractual rate, right? And that's their sweet spot, 15% below. The length, the duration of this slowdown, and the heavy conversations about it, the fact that we've all sort of aware of it, may have changed that pattern and changed the railroad's ability to continue to hold the line on price, which may be good for volume. We'll see. I'll also point out that in 2019 and 2018, the railroads suffered from the impacts of the trade war, first of all, which was a big deal then. It just got, it was like a little wave, and we all looked at the wave, and then, the tsunami of the pandemic came after it. But we have to remember, in addition, the railroads suffered, I think, by not having enough capacity in the domestic container fleet in 2019 or 2018, when regulations drove a lot of business from the highway to the railway. A lot of that came as trailer and flat car TOFC business. In 2019, when those regulations were loosened and a lot of truck capacity floated in, a lot of that business drove away. It wasn't sticky. And part of that is because I think the railroads and their partners didn't provide enough box capacity. And I think that was a pretty big fumble in the red zone, to use the football analogy.
Love it.
I'm not sure that will be the case as we come through this next cycle, because I'm very encouraged by, and one of the reasons I am encouraged is the capacity that's coming on from the IMCs, if not the railroads themselves.
So, Tony, real quick, you mentioned box capacity, and that's one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, because I feel like that's something that's very different. Where we're at today is, during COVID, everybody was in that really happy buying boxes, any boxes they could. I know we were finding, retired boxes, 48s, and pulling them out and dusting them off just to put anything in anything. But there was this huge buying of containers, and not there were people that didn't ever have containers that bought these small fleets of containers. So now you've got all these pockets of containers everywhere. And I feel like that causes some of this shift that we see in pricing. It's not just the railroads, right, that we're looking at. It's some of these box owners have to really decrease the pricing and maybe even take a loss to try and keep these things moving, because it's more costly to have them sitting. How do you see that working? Because it just feels like it's a whole different world with where the capacity is on the assets that are running on the railroad versus what we used to see in the past.
I think that's a really interesting point. I don't really know how to address it because it's hard to quantify. It's hard to see. It's like looking at the truckload market. When it's so fragmented, it makes it hard for analysts in New York. It becomes an anecdotal part. And so I hear you, and I'm listening, taking notes from what you're saying. And I think that's really interesting. What I'm excited about is the capacity plans that come on board from big IMCs, the JB Hunt, BNSF announcements, really all the press releases from railroads and their partners, some big IMCs, as we call them, shifting railroad partners, in the West down to Mexico, all the press releases of new services that are coming on, new alliances with CSX in Meridian, Mississippi, as much as that annoys people in Atlanta. All these things I think are a sign of kind of where, to me, that the railroads have come through a dark period, when they had supply chain issues, labor issues, safety issues. None of those issues have gone away, but we're out of the front pages, if you will, and are beginning to think about the future and are beginning to think about planning longer term, for a sustainable future rather than the next cycle alone. So that's what excites me. I think your point is a very good one. It's very hard for me to get my hands around that, though.
So what's really cool about that, Tony, you talk about the railroads and the improvements and the investments and what they're doing. And one of the things, because you study all of the rail activity, not just intermodal, and I think it's really neat how, they're combining services. So for instance, like the Barstow solution for BNSF out in Southern California. I mean, they're putting together transloading operations, carload mixed with truck, mixed with intermodal. I mean, all of the kind of outer line things that the railroads are getting into in as far as their investments. I think that's what we really need to be excited about and look for opportunities that are solutions, not just your point A to point B intermodal.
I think you're right there. The railroads have learned also that, a boxcar transload solution is very sticky if you can get in there, and can be permanently closed if you don't. So they're beginning to look more holistically at their system and what they can offer shippers, some of whom want, 53-foot box, and others of whom, paper business and other things where they lost share because they didn't have enough crews, but where the business is sort of a natural rail fit. I think they're refocusing there. I think there is a whole new mindset. We have essentially new leadership at every class one, pretty close to it, young leadership, often intermodal focused or marketing focused leadership. They're putting their money there. You talked about Barstow. It's really important also to see the success of LA Long Beach in regaining share that they had lost. They've been losing share secularly for a while, but, I'd say sort of false share loss when all the ships were backed up. And with that coming back, that's good for the whole ecosystem, right? Railroads prefer business into California than all water into the East Coast ports that often goes by truck. So I agree with you. I think the railroads are spending the money. It will be a constant battle, right? They've changed. I call it the great experiment. They're talking to their shareholders, who are a major stakeholder group, of course, and saying, we need to invest through a cycle. We can't, furlough and try to match exactly our supply with the anticipated demand. Nobody does that very well. Railroads are pretty bad at it. And so when things turn up quickly and you don't have enough, the highway is always there as an alternative, whether we're talking carload or intermodal. So they've got to think in a longer term way and not focus entirely on the operating ratio, the margin, but rather to look to the return on investment through a cycle. That was first expressed by Norfolk Southern and Alan Shaw a year ago, roughly today, where they talked about that. They talked about not furloughing people, retaining crews, et cetera. I think that philosophy, was simultaneously being followed by other carriers. They were just the first to really try to explain it to my stakeholder group, the investment community. That's a difficult thing to do when you start off in a freight recession and you say you're going to go plan for the long term. They need to really articulate how they're making successes that will show up next year and maybe even the year after that. So it's a battle that's never over.
So how would you say intermodal and rail are positioned next to truckload as potentially the volume starts to pick up?
I think they will have this time enough capacity, and I think they'll be growing that capacity, and they will be holding on to crews for the most part. And so, they will be more, they'll have flex capacity. When you try to run a just-in-time system, that works really well when the sun shines. But when it rains, and that rain could be literally rain, a washout, but it can also be, variations in volume and shipper use. If you don't have that capacity out there, you can't offer a reliable service. You can say, oh, I've been overwhelmed by the growth. I'm growing so fast, but my service is declining. We used to call that sort of a rich person's problem, right? You have too much growth. But the shipper remembers that and says, yeah, so maybe next time I won't, I'm going to plan to have more trucking capacity than that. The rails aren't reliable. They're not trustworthy. And I mean that, not in the literal sense that I can't trust that person. But, when volume goes up, if service goes down, the usual pattern, that is not a sustainable growth model. So the railroads need to sacrifice some short-term cost by having excess capacity for some time so that they're ready when that capacity is strained. They actually have, locomotives and track, capacity, and especially crew capacity. That's a changed mindset from the extremes that came out of precision scheduled railroading. PSR is never a bad thing, but when taken to the extreme, when you manage to the margin only, you focus on the costs, and you have, if you expect 100 units to move, you plan for capacity for 100 units. If it's 98 units, then you begin to shed capacity. But when it comes back and it's 105 units, and you have capacity for 98, you've upset a lot of people. That pattern has to be broken. Alan Shaw got the Innovator of the Year award at my RailTrends conference, really because he was the first to articulate that they need to change that, and that we in the investment community need to allow them, as the owners of these companies, to manage through a cycle, to manage for 102 capacity all the time, so that you're able to flex up and flex down. If things really come in at 110, everybody forgives you. But if simple growth overstrains the system, something that really isn't going well for the long term, we need to change that focus. Alan called it a perversion of PSR to manage to the operating ratio or the margin. Keith Creel of the CPKC said the operating ratio is important, but it's the outcome of a process. We need to get back to it being the outcome of the process rather than the end goal, if you understand what I'm saying. That whole mindset reflected itself all the way down to decisions on modal share in the Midwest. I mean, it all came from an over focus on one part of PSR. PSR has real validity, but you have to remember that the operating ratio is a valid measurement. It's not the be all and end all. From that mindset, the great experiment, this change, can flow things like the investment in BIG in California by BNSF, which I should point out never actually went to PSR. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely.
So one thing that you talked about with, being prepared for growth, one of the things that we saw during the pandemic was a shortage of, as Shelley mentioned, containers and chassis, things like that. Because of that, a lot of places were able to, or decided to, build more and get more prepared on the equipment front. So on the equipment side, are things really looking better as well for a coming growth in volume?
Yes, I believe that they are. But more importantly, is that they need to be for the growth spurt after this one, after this recovery and the one after that. I mean, it really has to be a changed long-term philosophy. In the short term, the economists are always wrong, right? And I can't blame them. And, what's going to happen in the first half of next year is hard to predict. The shorter the outlook, the harder it is to actually know. It's like the weather. But I do believe that that equipment will not hold shippers back in the next cycle. I also don't think crews will. So I think the industry is pretty well prepared. Now, you guys are on the ground, and I'm looking at it from New York City from 30,000 feet, and maybe you have a different opinion. But certainly, to some extent, they can live off the big buying of, for example, chassis that came after the shortage. Right, everybody went out and bought. Then the volumes turned the other way, so there's now excess. It's actually a better position to be in than to be short. Again, we used to call those rich people's problems. I have too much growth. I don't have enough to name the product, boxes, chassis, crews, whatever. But that is not a sustainable answer. I mean, there'll always be peaks that strain you, but you need to be able to manage. And of course, late 20, early 21, there were, the Peloton golden age when everybody was buying things may not be a normal way of looking at business. But what happened with the pandemic is it exposed some weaknesses of the PSR / just-in-time JIT system that this industry was using as its philosophy. Those were extreme low and high tides out there because of the pandemic. But I think it helped everybody change to what I think will be a more sustainable future, which may hold back some of the money counting in the good days, but will leave the better times throughout a cycle.
So, Tony, you talk about I found it very interesting on the things that came out of RailTrends and kind of I'm not going to say it exactly as eloquently as you did, but the reverse of PSR. And I think that's very interesting and important because I do think that from our perspective, the service on the rail is improving, but intermodal is only a portion of intermodal is rail, right? So for our customers, right. It's not so much, the rate needs to be where the net rate needs to be, but it's consistency. And so for them Absolutely. To get that comfort level to go back to that service, we really have to prove out the consistency. And to do that, that's a lot of what you're talking about with the railroads where there's, they're not going to continue to, be at that certain number to hold for a certain train length. They have to a certain extent, right? But you have to have some give there so that they can prove to the shipper community that there is that consistency. And to add to that, as the railroads get there, there's other parts of this intermodal service that have to coordinate with that as well. And I think that's when we really get to the golden time to overcome the truck capacity is when all those parts are moving together to create that consistency. Now, do things happen? Yeah, they're going to happen, but things happen in truck as well. But yes. I think that's where we really need to get to that golden spot to increase all this ability. There's plenty of freight out there. We need to build that confidence back up.
I agree 100%. And if I wasn't saying it correctly, that's part of what I think the great experiment is about having buffer stock, about not furloughing at the first sign of, slowdown. So you have enough crews. In the past, most of the workers would come back. It's a good job. When they finally got a wage increase and it was delayed by the length of the negotiations, now they're once again established that premium wage that a unionized rail worker gets. And you need to keep that, you can't be crew short. And as Alan pointed out in his investor day a year ago, now December of last year, that led me to start calling this a great experiment was that you need to manage through a whole cycle. That includes all of your assets, right? And the reason you need to do that is nowadays when you have a furlough, 1/3 come back. There are alternatives and there are other things people want to do, et cetera. And so you're short of crews. How do you have a customer trust you if you say, if you have this issue, you need to restore trust, building trust. I wrote about it as faith, restoring faith in the system is critical. And one of the ways to do this is not to try to manage so that every quarter, every 3-month period, looks perfect from a financial point of view, beats Wall Street expectations. That's not you need to manage so the customer believes that you're going to be there, that essentially you're going to retain a schedule. Yes, things do happen, and they happen to truck too, but that you're not going to hold trains and destroy a schedule, on the interline side, 1,000 miles away because of decisions made in the short term in this terminal. That can't be done. Railroads have shown they can do that in the past. They've just never done consistency consistently. That's kind of an odd way of saying it. I think they now know that that's probably, if you call it, the key phrases are consistency, reliability, that's, also out of RailTrends was collaboration in order to make this happen with other parts of that supply chain, and resiliency. Those are all sort of, nice words, but those, I think, really what managers are trying to do now versus in the past, really focus overly, even if they said they weren't, on short-term results. And short-term results mean matching your costs, your supply to demand in ways that really aren't sustainable, resilient, or reliable. And so the mistakes of the past, which were covered up by, good financial results, aren't a sustainable growth model. I think they know that. You phrased it better, but they need to offer a product that can be counted on. Frankly, when I started in this business, and I won't tell you exactly what year, but I'll let you know that there was a Bush in office and he was the older one. The key things I was told was, railroads, there's a problem in Chicago, interline service isn't very good and railroads aren't, consistent. All I need is consistency. The fact is that those three problems still exist. I've learned to think that Chicago is always, if Chicago is not stressed, then the economy is not working well. But the other two things, interline serviceability, which doesn't really show up that much in intermodal, but it does in the rest, and reliability. Those were the issues I was told had to be resolved in the 80s, and they're the issues that need to be resolved now. The difference is, I think new young management teams are actually addressing it and attacking that issue and are aware of it. And frankly, it's been helped by, no one ever wants to admit this, but the STB, the government regulator, and their focus on service and what that's done in reciprocal switching changes that are coming up, et cetera, has helped sharpen the focus. Everybody, I hate these kind of stock phrases, but everybody's pulling on the same side of the oar for the first time in a long time. In the past, when it was a cost-cutting focus, regulators were sort of ignored. Now they can't be ignored, and they're actually on the same side as the shipper. And hopefully now, so are the railroads.
Well, speaking of new young management, as you can tell if you've heard some of our past podcasts, we recently talked with Diego of AMTI, and I'm telling you, this is so exciting. This Mexico piece for us is something that we're putting a whole lot of focus on. I'm sure others are as well. And I think if I remember correctly, that you were fortunate to attend their conference. I'm so sorry you had to go to Cancun for that, Tony. So tell us a little bit about
it's tough work.
It's really tough. Yes. Tell us a little bit about where you see intermodal in Mexico. And one of the things that I was just floored that Diego mentioned to us, and Kevin, you have to tell me if I do this wrong, but I don't think I did. On the cross-border intermodal, 5%, is that what he said? 5% of the traffic cross-border and intermodal, and I'm just floored that, we all got to get together and improve that number real quickly.
So Diego's terrific. The AMTI meeting in Cancun's an odd place. Cancun only started in the 70s. Like, for an ancient country, you're at a place that nobody lived there in 1968, so it's kind of a weird place, but right, it is not tough duty to have a beautiful beach that you look at out the window. It was a great conference, and I'm looking forward to going again. Larry Gross and I both went, so they had some Yankees down there. And I will tell you another thing, just is anecdotally, the translators were phenomenal. So it was like real time. I didn't worry that my message wouldn't get across, but I ended up being able to hear what they had to say. And the domestic intermodal market is in its infancy there. Statistics aren't as reliable yet. Larry and I tried to say we need to improve that lot. But looking at Mexico, looking at the CPKC, coincidentally or not, and I think not, that merger has unlocked, a wave of creativity, new partnerships going to Eagle Pass, the Falcon service with CNUP and Ferromex, the JB Hunt BN Ferromex service, all these things, including going all the way to Meridian, Mississippi and CSX, all these are because of the Mexican market. Mexico is booming as a niche nearshoring potential. People question, is this Mexico's moment? And I always refer to the old saw that Mexico is the economy of the future, and it always will be. Can this time they bring that future to reality? I think they can. They are hindered by unstable government, right now, government by whim. The government is very pro-rail, but at the same time, they're like doing things, sending in the Marines into a Ferromex line, stopping refined products because they want to support Pemex, which is insane, bringing passenger service into the freight lines, which, we see is done in Canada and the US, but, is complicated. So, the government on the one hand is very appreciative of let's say, Ferromex and KCS down there, which they call Kansas, by the way, which I always find hilarious because Kansas City is actually in Missouri. But as those lines in Mexico, it's critical. A couple of points. They're booming in foreign direct investment as people are building plants in Mexico that we hear about, even some that may or may not happen. I never trust Elon Musk, but potentially an enormous Tesla plant, all these things we hear about. But keep in mind that Mexico is about a quarter of Latin American overall GDP, and they're getting about 17% of foreign direct investment. So while the growth numbers look huge, they're still underperforming the potential. Cross-border intermodal numbers are terrific. They're probably the fastest growing single component in North American freight railroading, and yet they're losing share or barely holding on to share, as you pointed out, at 5%. So, the glass is half full. Is look at all that business that historically Kansas City Southern did crossing the border at Laredo that now will be CPKC plus these others. But the other side, the glass is half empty, is even while they're doing that, there are more and more and more and more and more trucks. So the opportunity is huge under this new mindset. And Keith Creel, may have predated the great experiment, but, he always believed in efficiency leading to growth, not efficiency for its own sake. And so all these things, I think, offer a great opportunity. And Diego is right. The domestic market, as their middle class grows, will only be better. That's sort of in its infancy. The cross-border market. Another interesting factoid is about a quarter of the factory investment in Mexico is from China, which is trying to get, China is also trying to downplay China as it moves into, the U.S. market. But from our point of view, who cares? It's product moving. I think the opportunity is huge. But even in that empty conference that Diego referenced, the big players there said, we can't blow it. We're gifted this huge opportunity. We're next to the biggest market in the world, and we're part of the biggest market in the world. And we needed to do better than we had in various other Mexico moments that never really came to full fruition. It's always been a good growth market. It's just not living up to potential. I believe the new leaderships all around, including people like Diego and AMTI, which was put on that great conference, are going to change that. I'm glad to hear that you're excited about it. I was shocked in the CPKC merger application to the Surface Transportation Board that they did not really talk about trucks off the highway. That used to be in all the earlier mergers in the 90s and early aughts. Everybody talked about trucks off the highway, and probably most of those things were never back-checked or achieved. And I talked to one strategist with the split of Conrail who said, we could take 1 million trucks off the highway. And I said, how did you achieve that number? And he looked at me and said, I made it up. But, Congress believed it. So here they had a very specific number, and it was like 160,000 trucks. That's great, but it's a drop in the bucket. Part of my belief is they're trying to, be realistic. And in addition, they really wanted to focus on their rail-to-rail competition, specifically with the Union Pacific and those north-south lanes that have led to the flurry of press releases I talked about. And I think also because he thought that the STB believes that rails are monopolistic, which I think is insane. We can talk about that separately. But so therefore injecting more competition, which he clearly has, meant that Keith was, addressing a specific regulator's need. Now that we're past that, it's been approved. I think they're beginning to open up a little more about the highway opportunity. When I talk about railroads as monopolists, and some of your listeners may say they are, or duopolists, it's one of the times when I've said to the chairman, now outgoing chairman Marty Oberman, in some ways as a Wall Street analyst, I wish the STB had more power. And he looked at me like, what do you mean? You think everything I say is, nuts. And I said, yes, Marty, that's true. But you only look at rails, right next to, if you look, there's a highway right next to that plant that is complaining about rail monopolistic powers. And, as we saw when CSX went through PSR and they had a big hearing on the Hill, and CSX had a very violent conversion to this new theory under Hunter Harrison. They let go a lot of people that nobody was answering sales calls and all this. So the shippers got up and testified. CSX has been terrible to me. I had to turn to more trucking, and it cost, my logistics budget went up by 15% or so. And I remember sitting up and saying, that's the end of the monopoly argument. You wish to use rail because when it works, it's more efficient, it's cheaper, etc. But you can use something else. So we here in the intermodal space know there is a competitive alternative out there. And in fact, one that's been winning since 2008. As I say to Marty, name another monopoly that loses market share. I mean, by definition, a monopoly is all the share. right? Well, here's a monopoly that's losing share. We've addressed that in the beginning. It's one that needs to stop losing share, and because consistent and change. So, I'll get off my soapbox about the STB. I like all those people a lot, but I don't always mostly don't agree with them. So with all that being said, that's why I think that the focus really was on rail to rail competition and the application, but the focus, and that is clear that that's happening, and there's responses to it, and it's been pretty positive, I think. But it's the truck that's the opportunity cross-border, as you pointed out in the beginning before I went on this long-winded answer.
As we wrap up, I wanted to ask, from an analyst perspective, are the Dodgers getting Ohtani or not? What do you think?
They better. They didn't buy anybody last year. They've by Dodger standards, they've put a lot of money in their piggy bank, and they have a lot of money. The whole money situation has changed. I don't know how long it takes you to process this, but I'm hopeful that by the time people hear my raspy voice, for which, again, I apologize, that we'll have that I'll have bought a new jersey with Japanese lettering on the back of it. Well, I sure hope so.
Yeah, it'll be
we're
close.
The front runners. Why wouldn't you want to go to there? He likes the West Coast. I mean, it's a great market for somebody who will be a superstar in Japan and North America. It's a great spot to be. So I'm very hopeful. They have made it, they stopped being coy about it. They said just the other day that it's their number one goal.
Right.
So they need to.
Well, Tony, thanks very much for your time. Where can people find more from you?
Well, and I want to assure people that if they talk to me in the future, I won't sound this bad. We're wrapping up the year, and on the year's stress on me, I have one more visit to Chicago, and then I'm basically coasting to the new year. You can find me in New York. You can reach me at abh18@mindspring.com. That probably is a great way to start. And if any of you have my slide decks and whatnot, my contact info is always there. Happy to speak to anybody who wants to question what I said here. I would love to know if I'm off base on any of this by people who are out there in the field actually doing it rather than in New York looking at weekly numbers.
All right, Tony. Thanks very much for your time.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you, guys, and happy holidays.
Yeah,
same to you. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Thanks for joining us for InTek Freight and Logistics, the podcast, and thanks very much to Tony Hatch for taking the time to speak with us. Check out the links in the description to learn more about everything we discussed. Subscribe or follow now to ensure you get our latest episodes as soon as they're available, and you can help us out by rating and reviewing us wherever you listen. If you have questions, email us at podcast@intechlogistics.com and visit intechfreight-logistics.com for more about what we do. For Shelley Austin and Rick Lagore, I'm Kevin Baxter. We'll talk to you next time.